Bailey Hess. I see Eugenia Wu, if you can raise your hand, say hello. Also with Historic Seattle, Kai Kelly. I'm not sure if you have a video on Kai, but Kai is on this call as well. Welcome, everybody. You'll see on the screen here our conversation guidelines. Just a reminder to please be aware that we have a limited time frame and to please share the floor so that everybody has an opportunity to contribute to the conversation. We do have a kind of a large number of people registered. I'm not sure how many will actually turn out for this meeting, but we're going to try enabling everybody, once the discussion begins, after I say a few words here, we're going to try enabling everybody's microphone so that you can contribute to the conversation. Please stay muted when you're not speaking. And if it becomes too much, we may, Naomi has the capability to mute everyone, and then we'll just go by a show of hands when you're ready to speak. And we'll try to keep track of the order of that. So please be patient and bear with us on that. The chat feature, if you're familiar or if you're not familiar with that, down at the bottom, the little icon is a great way to make comments. And, you know, we want to avoid having tangential conversations, but that's a great way to make comments and, you know, kind of throw something out there to the group without interrupting. Let's see, are there other staff on here to introduce? I don't see anyone. Oh, Danielle Quinnell just came on. I think she's just coming on now. Danielle is our newest staff member. She just joined Historic Seattle as our office administrator. So she'll give a wave when her video comes on, if it's not already. In any conversation about land use, it's necessary to acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the unceded and traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and that we occupy this land. This acknowledgement does not take the place of authentic relationships with Indigenous communities, but serves as a first step in honoring the land that we occupy. This statement is borrowed from the City of Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, while Historic Seattle develops its own land acknowledgement. Okay. We wanted to start out by doing a little show of hands. We wanted to know who is reading this book for the first time? Who among us are rereading? Okay, and who read this book when it was first published? Okay. Good to know. All right. Great, we're gonna go ahead and open the discussion now. I'm gonna follow the discussion guidelines that were emailed to you. So hopefully you've had an opportunity to look at those and think about those. The first question is more of a open discussion topic. This book was published almost 60 years ago, and the country has changed a lot since then. How has this book held up? Many of the concepts and observations seem to hold true today. Many do not. Please discuss. What are your thoughts?
I guess I'm going to dare to jump in if nobody else does. I think on the whole, it's held up pretty well. I think somebody writing the book now would probably be much more conscious of talking about issues of race and probably gender, which are remarkably, especially the former, largely missing from the book. But I think in its observations about how neighborhoods function, it's still, I mean, let's face it, most of our thinking in the last 50 years plus about what actually functions in a city derives from probably this and Lewis Mumford.
Derives from, what was the last part? I'm sorry.
Sorry, derives from this and also the work of Lewis Mumford.
Ah.
This is Ruth Danner, and this is my first time to read the book, and I've only read part 1 and the introduction. And as much as I am, I self-identify as a fan of Jane Jacobs' work, having never read it. It's difficult as a first-time reader to see information about 1959 and not want to stop and go out and see how the trends have been in those same communities. Los Angeles in particular, Philadelphia, all of the neighborhoods that she cites in that first part. I really want to know more. Do her insights hold true after 60 years? It's a long time.
I was going to add one thing. I haven't been able to get a new copy of the book. So I'm kind of, been looking at study guides and things that I've been able to identify and get my hands on. But I think that it's really important to recognize that so much of when we're talking about the city and when she's talking about the city, she's not taking into account the whole growth of suburbs and what that has done to the fabric of our cities, and how going to the suburbs, coming back to the suburbs, and now I'm hearing about trends of people leaving the city and no longer needing to be in the heart of the city. So I think there are a whole bunch of things that are problematic now in embracing Jane's view unthinking. I also should note that I graduated from high school the same year the book was published.
So I think the thing that's held up the best, because every land use planner will cite it to you, is that we need eyes on the street, and we should have no blind buildings and no solid walls facing sidewalks. And that's just pretty much de rigueur for architects in urban centers. You don't do that in a pedestrianized city. So that's great. There are a lot of things that, of course, have changed. And she's writing from the perspective of Greenwich Village when it was cheap to live there. And now those brownstones are over $1 million, $2 million each. And some of the things that people try to draw from her vivid descriptions of street life and in the sidewalk community. Right now in Seattle, the urbanists are trying to bring back corner stores in our neighborhoods. And I don't think that's going to work at all. I used to live in Ballard, and there are some former corner stores in our older neighborhoods like Ballard and Wallingford. But in terms of commercially viable, no. So building the building doesn't make it work. And the urbanists who think that they can zone for that, a lot of people think that zoning has more power than it does. You can zone for stuff and nobody will build it, right?
Yeah. Does anybody want to add to that before we move on to the next question?
I have something to, this is the first time reading it for me, and I actually lived in New York for about 15 years and still have an apartment in Brooklyn Heights. And so I really appreciate a lot of the work she did then, back in the day to save our neighborhoods. And some of that hasn't held up is the park uses, and that I recognize some of these parks, and maybe other people do too, like Sarah Delano Roosevelt Park, is actually used. Like I was there a year or so ago, and people using, kind of is down on it, like for whatever reason, and I'm like, well, no, folks are actually using it and using the play field, or using the play recreation areas and all that. So in the last 60 years, that's changed, and people have adapted, and the neighborhood's grown in a different way. And so I think someone said, like, they want to know about where these neighborhoods are now, and some of them have changed in a different way than she had predicted. I'm finding it very interesting.
Another.
Oh, sorry, I saw
Sorry.
Courtney's hand.
I forgot what I was going to say. I was thinking about in Seattle specifically, just, you know, everybody knows we have an affordability problem. And just seeing small businesses have to leave because their property value has gone up so much they can't afford their property taxes anymore. So I almost wonder if, rather than just zoning, if, you know, having different property tax allocations or something. Yeah, it just seems really complicated nowadays, between corporations kind of absorbing a lot of that small shop economy, as well as, I don't know, there was a revitalization of small businesses for sure going on in Seattle, it seemed like. And I feel like the suburbs are adopting, sort of trying to create those little density pockets. But yeah, it just seems like it's hard to read this book and not think about what changed with the economics, that people can't afford to live on the streets in the same way anymore.
Ricky, was that you? That was.
I was just going to say, as another New York native, Morningside Heights, a lot of that in her book, and coming at it from the perspective she has as an outsider, really takes into account the vibrancy of different parts of the country's big cities, but at the same time recognizes that those will not hold up in that vibrancy unless there's the family aspect of raising kids there. And I think that that's changed as far as a lot of the urbanized areas, about how appealing they are to young families. Considering now coronavirus, you're looking at a different ball game, because now the exodus has begun, and we're seeing that in real estate trends. And clearly that can lead to other opportunities in cities, which might end up being a good thing. You might not have the exorbitant rents that people cannot pay anymore. Hopefully some new blood will get in there, and you'll have those neighborhoods reestablish themselves. But at the same time, you cannot consider that Jane would have known what the 2020 situation would be. So taking it for what it is 60 years later, I think it's wonderful to see what she was saying has so much relevance today. That's it.
It's Ruth again. It's too bad her crystal ball could not have possibly imagined Amazon and its impact on retail. I'm actively involved in following land use issues down in District 7, right at First and Pike. And all the buildings there require street use purposes on the ground level. So they're programming in all the new high rises, they're programming in retail space on the ground floor. And I have no earthly idea what good it's going to be with Amazon being the juggernaut that it is.
Just to second that and elaborate on it, all the mid-rise, typical 7-story mid-rise residential buildings require commercial on the ground floor. And fortunately, they're changing that to include childcare, which is greatly needed. And so we see some better uses, but at the same time, we know that for years there have been mostly vacancies in these newer buildings. And part of the reason is that they make the spaces 10,000 square feet, And that's far too big for a startup, for a very small business. And the first occupant has to pay the build out. You have to, if it's a restaurant, you got to build in a kitchen and build in a bathroom and all the other stuff. And same with a doctor's office, very expensive build out. So they're too big and too expensive for small businesses, which really need the older buildings. Sometimes you see a little antique court. You walk in and there'll be small businesses of, 1,000 square feet or even less, all lined up along an aisle. And that's the way new businesses get started, in older buildings with smaller spaces. So although we require these corporations to build, commercial space, we haven't required them to rent it or to make it rentable or to subdivide it. We haven't provided subsidies to help the build out, which the city could do. There's a lot that we could do to stimulate small businesses, but it's not there. And I do think part of it is preservation and looking to older buildings.
Thank you, Sarah. You're kind of naturally segueing to our next question, which, and please feel free to continue to add to that first discussion at any time. But the next question is, according to Jacobs, how does city planning contribute to the decay of cities? And I think you were just starting to heat that one up.
So it's Ruth again. And the eye-opener for me in Jacob's book was that really diversity is the key. And I've always thought that, well, the industrial zone should be kept purely industrial. We don't want people complaining about the noise they make while they're trying to sleep. The office buildings should be in the office core, that sort of thing. And as it turns out, diversity is, according to Jacobs, and I think it's a really good point in all aspects of diversity, is the key to success.
Lana raised her hand. Some people have figured out you can literally do this, or there's also a little feature button that'll put a hand up in your corner, so you can raise your hand that way too. Go ahead, Lana.
Hi. I think the main thing, which I also found very, very true from my own experience, is that cities build newer housing and essentially create displacement by doing that. Because better housing, at least according to Jane Jacobs, does not necessarily mean better life, which of course housing should be adequate and pleasant. But she criticizes the housing developments that mean to improve the life of residents, usually low income residents, but instead they destroy community. And people don't end up using the amenities in the way planners think they will and they should, because their way of life has disappeared. Their friends are on the other side of town, and they just don't have the same relationship with that landscape and that neighborhood.
Thank you. Jacobs notes that the streets of successful city neighborhoods must have three main qualities. There must be a clear demarcation between what is public space and what is private space. There must be eyes upon the street, eyes belonging to those we might call the natural proprietors of the street. The sidewalk must have users on it fairly continuously. Can you think of examples of neighborhoods that have these three qualities in Seattle?
Joe, I see.
Actually, even though it's a rather suburban neighborhood, I think my own neighborhood of Wedgwood, to a remarkable degree, functions that way, much more than I would have expected when I moved into it. But I'd also like to say conversely that I don't necessarily agree with her about the strong demarcation of public and private. And if anyone has spent any time in Berlin, there's an enormous amount of space in Berlin where it's very hard immediately to work out whether something is public or private. And where hence it's de facto public unless you act badly. And I think that works extremely well in Berlin. And I don't see very many equivalents of that in the US, except perhaps something like the open space at Westlake Center that's on private land. But when there's only a few of them, it gets much more tendentious than when that's actually a common kind of space in a city.
Michael?
I would just think that right now we're into an interesting moment of transition in that regard. There are these issues of taking the right of way, where we have these safe, healthy streets now, where the right of way has been sort of compromised insofar as distinguishing between private space and public space. And even in my neighborhood, where although I've seen already a number of restaurants closing on Queen Anne, there are a number of restaurants that are now bumping out into the street, taking over parking places. So there's a huge confusion happening right now between what is private and what is public. And it's failed generally in Seattle. There was a movement to do something called parklets. And there are spaces where a parklet was paid for by, contributions from the people. There was one in front of the Uptown Theater. And it just ends up being the confusion about who can use it, what is it for, and it's not clear at all. I think we're really not into a really blending of space in a strange, maybe even uncontrolled way.
Anyone want to add to that? Okay. What examples in Seattle are there of successful parks and park failures? Do the elements for success or failures, diversity, intricacy, centering, sun, and enclosure that Jacobs identifies apply to these examples?
Rebecca?
I wonder if the Northwest is a little bit different from the parts of the country that she's talking about, because what makes our park successful sometimes are totally different than the things that she's listing. I'm thinking of Discovery Park, for example, way out of the way. Nobody would never go to that part of Magnolia unless they actually live there, and yet people love to go there. So some of them are just a way to get away into a wilder place that I think is not true for every city.
I think of Green Lake, which I live close by to, and that one definitely, in my opinion, seems to hit all those criteria with a diversity of use and at different times of the day, and the lake being perhaps the centering area, or maybe the community center and the pool. There's lots of different centers, plenty of sun, an enclosure with the perimeter road and the walking trail, kind of a double perimeter to enclose it.
Yeah, I'd agree that she's the one that's the most like Jane Jacobs, and that's probably arguably the most successful park in Seattle. How many people go to Green Lake every day, and it's got all of the qualities she was talking about.
Christine, you had your hand.
Yeah, I was going to second what Rebecca said. I actually grew up a block from Discovery Park and live in the house I grew up in, and I can tell you in the last 3 months, Discovery Park has been very, very successful and very popular. And I feel like half the city is actually in the park. And reading this, I kind of was really thinking about why it's so popular. And because it's sort of a scary, there are areas of it that are kind of scary and kind of, it's wild, and you could definitely feel unsafe. And I think she made a point of something about the neighborhood around a park, how much it impacts the park itself and whether or not people feel comfortable going there. And I can't remember the exact phrasing. And something could be kind of have a lot of open area, or it could be very I don't know how she described it, but not a lot of trees, and people still wouldn't feel comfortable going there. There could be a lot of open space, I guess. And then in other places, it could be closed off and people would feel comfortable going there. So I wasn't sure like what kind of point she was making other than the economic point about that, of like, if people feel comfortable in the surrounding neighborhood, then they'll feel comfortable in the park. I don't know, but I kind of feel like Discovery Park is one of those that it's a popular park, but it doesn't necessarily fit the traditional model of, if you were going to plan a perfect park, or like a popular park, like this is what you would do. I don't think any planner would do that. It would create a Discovery Park. So,
Joe?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one that I think in Seattle, and in ways very relevant to Jacob's thinking, teeters between successful and unsuccessful, is Steinbrook Park, which is much more analogous to a lot of the smaller parks in New York City, both in the fact that it is used by people from literally the full spectrum economically, and it's in a dense part of the city. It's in something much more comparable to the kind of urban textures that she was thinking about as a New Yorker. And we can see that at times that park works very well, and at other times it doesn't. And I think it's a very interesting case if you wanted to look at her thoughts and how they would or wouldn't apply to this city.
Sarah Jane?
A good example and a bad example. You probably know about the Highline Park in New York City and West Chelsea that has completely transformed the neighborhood. It's now, all of the property is turned over, and it's the hot neighborhood, and got hot restaurants and boutiques and everything. So just changing that use, what was an abandoned railroad track, and taking advantage of all the views and so on, has made an amazing difference. And it is about how a park can activate a whole neighborhood and revive it. Probably you don't know that there's a park on the north side of Northgate, north of Target, right? Called Hubbard Homestead Park. That used to be the parking lot there. And it's been there for about 10 years, and it's just nothing. There's some grass and some gravel, and basically no trees. There's a skate park in one corner, and other than that, it gets very little use. There are 4 senior housing projects around it. So you've got a huge component of seniors who, I'm on the board of North Haven, and we need people to get out and walk and go there and be motivated to go there. But when you get there, there's nothing. There's no shade, there are no flowers, there's no trees. And I envision what Jacobs would do to that, which is to have a water feature, a splash fountain that would attract kids, and having kids to watch attracts seniors, and having shade would make a huge difference. And so none of these things were done. In fact, what my understanding is that the money was taken from what was supposed to be sent there and used for Lake Union. So it's just a typical Seattle politics, but it's a waste, and it's frustrating to me.
Eugenia?
Hi everyone. Can you hear? I had to come outside and I live half a block from I-5, so I don't know if you can hear that or not. It was great to see so many familiar faces and new faces. I thought it was interesting, unless I missed it. Did Jane Jacobs mention Homestead at all when we were talking about parks? I don't think so. I thought that was fascinating. I checked the index too. I read that section, and I was just curious as how, Homestead and the Homestead brothers have had such a big influence on our park system in so many cities. And to me, I was wondering, it's like, why did she bring it up in her book? And did she think it was successful or not? And it was just sort of, so now I'm bringing up more of another question rather than sort of answering the question. But yeah, Bailey, I think Green Lake has just been, especially with the pandemic, it's just been so much more active than normal. And it's successful for all the reasons you stated, but also what's across the street and around it, and all those normally the restaurants and the shops and the stores and all that is that activity that really helps. It's bring more people and all that.
And the tiny tot pond.
Yeah, and I don't know if you know, but the Green Lake Pool and Community Center is slated to be replaced. And I'm going off topic now, but it is about preservation. The concrete, the pool was an addition, and it was designed by a very famous structural engineer. And it was his first sort of thin shell concrete building, and it might get demolished to this whole thing. So sorry, that was my tangent. Gotta do advocacy, but yeah, I think Green Lake is a very successful park. In terms of unsuccessful ones, I don't know. Sometimes it's sort of, I go back to what Jane was saying. Sort of planner. It seems like everyone's answer is open space, open space. She kept saying that. Just add open space, and that'll solve all your problems. And I think her point is like, no, just having open space for the sake of open space is not necessarily a benefit or a value to a neighborhood or a community.
Joe?
I would say another park that's very interesting in terms of Jacob's thinking. If you look at the change in Hinghey Park when they doubled the size of it and much more activated it with the new half of it. I think previously Hinghey was a rather failed park, and I don't know about during COVID times, and I haven't been down there, but in normal times now is a very successful park. And I think when we're thinking about Jacob's writing about parks, I don't think she's thinking of big things like Discovery Park or even particularly New York Central Park and Prospect Park. She's thinking of the kind of parks that relate directly to the texture of neighborhoods. I mean, she was a Greenwich Village person, Washington Square, Tompkins Square. And I also think her thinking was extremely influential on the rise of vest pocket parks. Which, there were very few vest pocket parks in New York in '59. And I mean, I speak as someone who grew up in New York, and while I was a child at that time, I remember when vest pocket parks started to happen and what a transformation they were, that all these neighborhoods that had no park in reasonable walking distance suddenly had a one building lot park.
I think the worst park in Seattle is its First Park, which I live near to and observe Denny Park on a regular basis, and am stunned by how in regular times it is completely unutilized, just always. Right now, that's not true. Right now, a lot of people without homes have taken up camping there, and it is honestly, it's strange to see because it's the first time the park has seemed to have a purpose, and it's not one that I wish was necessary, but it's the most people I've seen there in 2 years of being in such close proximity to it. And in regular times, I've seen the city and Amazon and various other downtown businesses try to activate it for, they did the Christmas light thing, the installation, and people just don't go. And the only thing that makes any sense to me, the more I try to navigate around it and run around it and now use park space more than normal, is that it is blocked off by Denny and a huge amount of traffic with noise and pollution and just misery to be around. And it's funny to me because as a historic park, you'd think it would have a purpose to the city, and it truly regularly does not seem to. And I'm seeing some hands. I see Lana's hand, sorry. Go ahead, Lana.
I was going to comment about that park in particular and also the parklets, is that what I notice is it's kind of like one of those situations where the planners just throw something out there and think that people will use it, but the furniture in the parklets and in Denny Park is horrible. It's like I've actually tried to sit there and sip on my coffee while I was waiting for a class to begin in a nearby School of Visual Concepts. Those chairs are impossible to sit on.
Oh no.
Yeah, like this looks like a great idea, but like the furniture is wobbly and it has all these sharp angles that poke you in all sorts of places. And it's just like, it's kind of like things are done for the sake of being done, but without any considerations of whether they're usable. And I think part of it is that the planners don't, it's like, what is it called? Hostile architecture, is maybe they don't want to put furniture in place that will encourage people to sleep on, which is a whole different issue. Hostile architecture is very problematic. But even just for sitting there, it's just not comfortable. And if something's not comfortable, people are not going to use it. So perhaps if they followed sort of more the patterns of use, then maybe the places will be better utilized.
Ruth, I see your hand.
Thanks. So I don't know who in our group has been to Yesler Terrace since their recent rebuilding. They have a new park. They also have Yesler Terrace, I think was always low income development. And now in order to have the resources to build more low income housing, they've actually partnered with market rate developers to develop a mix of medium housing and I hope it's a medium market rate housing and low income housing, plus this park. And this park is fantastic. Around the edge there is a coffee shop and a little restaurant, lunch counter kind of place. There's great play equipment for the children and a little bit of a sprinkler thing that they can activate by doing, you know, busy little things to it, and they can have impacts on the water, the children. And then there's a hill climb that the adults and children both accessible, and stairs. It's just fantastic. And then there's local art embedded in the walls. If you haven't been there, I'm very hopeful that this park will be a huge success, and it seems to follow a lot of the principles that she talks about.
I don't see any hands. Bailey, you want to move to the next one?
Death and Life of Great American Cities was published during the Civil Rights era of the 1950s and 60s. How do Jacob's observations of neighborhood quality hold up when viewed through a contemporary lens of racial equity?
Anyone? Michael?
Well, does it help to know that at least when I visited the village in high school, Greenwich Village, I think it was pretty homogeneous, and that the issues of race just weren't on the table. And so it's kind of hard to hold chain up to that standard in that sense. So it's a really significant, New York City is a really significantly different place now, and so is Seattle. But I don't think I've answered the question. I've just tried to throw out that tidbit.
Ruth, I see your hand.
Yeah, Seattle, I come from a smaller place and much more homogeneous and a lot less diversity. But I'm a liberal at heart, and I'm really disappointed in what I've seen with gentrification in communities that, I mean, all over Seattle. And I just think that race is everybody's blind to the race issue when it comes to money. It's really way more about real estate values and economy and what the person who can afford it wants, and nobody really knows what's going on with those communities that are disturbed.
To be more specific, most of us know the Central District used to be redline, used to be home for a lot of Black people, families, and institutions, especially Black churches. And many of them have been forced to move because their their people moved to the south suburbs. So Central District has gone from about 70% Black to 17% Black, something like that. And so the recent demands to cut the budget for the police by 50% came from a group of 10 Black ministers. And so there's a whole movement in the Central District to reclaim space. And they built the Liberty Bank building, which is a residential building for about 180 low-income units that is on the site of what was a Black-owned bank. It's wonderful to see. I went to the opening and the artwork, and it's amazing. And so they're trying to build more housing down there. So one of the announcements recently by the mayor was to build in response to these Black leaders, was to build 1,000 units of low-income housing in the Central District, period. And my one reaction was, well, what about where I live? You know, in Lake City, we have a lot of poor people here. So it's narrow and it's focused, and it's trying to make space for people whose roots have been cut out from under them. So the whole dynamic is really interesting to watch.
Yeah, I'm bringing it up again, but the property tax thing, you know, people get priced out of their neighborhood just based on the tax they're paying on a home that has historically been in their family for generations. And I guess it's frustrating to me that the most vulnerable are the first to, you know, just get shoved along, and then, hey, we'll build a whole bunch of low-income housing. Well, what does that do to the fabric of that community, the storefronts that were there? You know, so I just think there's not a lot of cultural sensitivity in terms of, you know, they talk about economic opportunity zones, but I don't know. I just wish city planners found other ways that you can make sure you preserve certain neighborhoods that are typically more vulnerable to being moved along. And I just don't feel like there's been a lot of political will for that. Instead, it's just like, let's just build these enormous units and kind of deconstruct the whole neighborhood and then rebuild it according to our plan.
Yeah, it seems a lot of
the legislature just fixed the income, the property tax by raising the limit, household income limit, from 40,000 to about 60,000. And so there've been a huge amount of applications for low-income homeowners to apply to get their property taxes cut way back, which is really a great thing. They're processing them. There was an announcement this week. So that's, you're right, and you've been heard, and many of us who advocated for that. But so there's a whole difference. Central District used to be an area of Black home ownership, and what's being built is apartments, rental apartments, low-income rental apartments. So the issue of home ownership for low-income people is not being addressed, and the whole HALA MHA legislation just completely overlooked displacement and gentrification because it was written by developers.
The policies are built by planners who want to attract people and make space for people coming, and don't take into account people who are here and need to stay and want to stay. Maya, I see your chat. What do you have to add?
Yeah, I just want to say one other observation. I grew up in the Central area, and it was a real vibrant community when I was growing up. There were shops, there were places to walk. Talk about eyes on the street. You know, we knew safe places to go. You know, it was just heartbreaking what happened to the Central area. My mom still lives on the north edge of the CD, but you know, and I'm still pretty tied in. A lot of us come from our places out of town, and I say,
so you
to
had
go back
lunch?
to our roots, you know.
Sorry, continue, Maya.
No, I guess I just needed to throw in my 2 cents worth. It really is. I've only lived in 2 neighborhoods, and I haven't been to these big cities that Jane Jacobs refers to. So I'm really, frankly, kind of clueless. But I'm really interested in hearing everyone else's opinions on these things. So, but I did want to just give a cheer for how the central area used to be, because we got so trashed. We just always were the underdog, except perhaps maybe more so the South End.
Well, thank you, Maya. Do we want to move on to sidewalks? I saw that Courtney had a great comment in there, so I'll allow you all to, or you can look at it, and Courtney, if you wanted to refer back to that. Jacobs identifies 3 purposes for sidewalks: safety, contact, and assimilating children. How do these uses work together to create a better city? That's part A.
Sorry, if I'm talking too much, you can tell me to stand down. I kept thinking, has anyone else read Christopher Alexander's Pattern Language? Yeah, it just came to mind so much because he talks about, places that create life. And I just think what she's describing is, how do you attract the most possible life? And children are a part of that, having, diversity of ages, as well as, backgrounds and ethnicities, I think are really important, but diversity of use. And I think she just did a really good job illuminating why it works that way, because of people showing up at different times of day, and the human innate need for safety. But yeah, I kept kind of thinking about Christopher Alexander and what he would say too while I was reading it.
Thank you.
I think you're, oh, sorry. I was curious, those of you who are from New York or lived there in the past, I'd be curious if you know sort of, so in Greenwich Village where she lives, I'd be curious as to what exact block she was on and how that's changed now, and what is her old home like now.
I looked her up, Eugenia, because I was trying to figure out, when she mentions the White Horse Bar, there was one by my apartment. I think it moved from where she was to the financial district. And so I looked it up, and I found this great article that I thought would only be interesting to me, but I think I'll share it in the chat. It's all the places she lived in New York. So it tells you her exact homes and like what they cost at the time and what was near them. So you can, and it gives you the dates, so you can kind of put that into the context of the book. I'll put that in the chat in just a second once I find it again.
Yeah, she was so descriptive, and I just, I could just envision her block and the streets and all the different shop owners. And I love her thing about, you can leave your key with the baker, and and your friend could go there and pick it up. It's like, wow.
Can you imagine?
I got that. It's like, well, yeah, you can't leave it under your doorstep because someone will. But yeah, it's so. I could just sort of envision what she was describing and wanting to be in that world. And I know we've all, those of us who aren't from there or lived there but have visited, that's the New York that I think about and want to experience, and that you see in movies as well or TV.
Perhaps there's a certain irony. She grew up in Scranton and ended up, when she wrote the book, just getting out of the United States and moving to Toronto.
Jacob's Ruth, or somebody's going to speak?
Yeah, it's Ruth. I love her description of the ballet on the sidewalk. It was beautiful. It was romantic, of a bygone era, but I think that in Seattle, I live down on 2nd and Pike, right by Pike Place Market, and I think we have given over in this decade, this century, to past the tipping point of preferring isolation, individual isolation, to sharing. And I think that even though we have a gazillion eyes on the street and we're part of it and we walk around in it and we enjoy it and we, you know, drink our coffee and walk around and, you know, do a little shopping and whatnot. And, but that human connection is really missing from that beautiful description.
Joe?
I think it depends. I think actually this is a thing that very much comes down to individual neighborhoods. And some Seattle neighborhoods function extremely well, some extremely poorly, and some in between. At different points in time, it's going to be different in different places. It's funny because, as I say, where I live in Wedgwood is rather suburban compared to anything Jacobs was thinking about, but actually functions in many ways like that. The leave the key with the neighbor thing is something that absolutely would happen here. Everybody on the block I live in has the contact information of everybody else on the block. And like just the other day, a cat died in my yard, and you know, it was completely quick to get to who owned that cat and have more than one person here to support her, dealing emotionally with the fact that her cat had just died and things like that. Even in the COVID time, the local coffee house, what's happening since they're doing takeout only is their parking lot has become a gathering place where people stay distanced and drink their coffee, and it becomes a neighborhood center. I mean, you know, there's neighborhoods that really do function that way, but there's also many that don't.
Yeah, Christine?
Yeah, I wanted to, I agree with that, Joe. I also wanted to respond to Eugenia's question about Greenwich Village and where she lived. And I think that certain neighborhoods in New York have been preserved really well, like the historic areas have been preserved really well. And in Brooklyn Heights, which is similar, the old, it was first historic district, I think, in the city. And so a lot of doing any sort of development or any sort of facade work on a building, it's huge amount of hoops to jump through. And so everything's kind of stuck in amber a little bit, and it's wonderful, and it looks like a movie set, and it's great for people who can afford it. But so it hasn't changed that much except for the prices. And I think that when we talk also about equity and like who kind of bears the brunt of change, I was thinking that after you asked that question, I'm like, well, when we do have to develop, when we do have to build new apartments and have density and any of these things, it doesn't happen in those neighborhoods, really. I mean, it happens in neighborhoods where people can least fight for keeping their way of life and keeping their neighborhoods intact. And so they bear the brunt of having that density that we need in some places. So it hasn't changed all that much since her time. And I think maybe I don't know how I feel about that, because it's great. It's great to to preserve that architecture, but at the same time, it kind of sets it in stone for the future. And so other areas have to take the development. So I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that.
Just want to chime in and point out the time. We've got about 5 more minutes.
I saw Courtney's hand.
Maybe.
You went muted, Courtney.
Okay. I keep thinking, I don't want to waste our time, but I keep thinking about the food trucks and how they have actually helped bring some of the eyes to the street and some life to the street. So I just think it's interesting when we do find ways that in an affordable way, it brings more diversity and life.
Yeah. Do we think the eyes on the street philosophy still holds true today? I know there's been some discussion around this, but does anybody have anything further they want to add to that?
I want to add that the part about assimilating children, that one of the functions of sidewalks, that doesn't work at all, because we won't let children out without their parents. And in her time and place, you know, kids played in the street. They actually played stickball and all kinds of other games. And there were always kids out without their parents. And since parents have been frightened to death, despite the fact that in most places the crime rate and both the violent crime and property crime are a fraction of what they were decades ago, parents are too frightened to let their kids out without their eyes on them. So the eyes on the public eyes doesn't help any. And now, of course, the kids are on their screens.
Yeah. Does anybody have any examples of the assimilating children function actually still happening with the sidewalks?
Again, I hate to be touting my neighborhood over and over. It absolutely happens here. Kids play in the street here. Loose supervision by the adults who happen to be around. But I don't think there are many neighborhoods in Seattle that function that way.
I think it's the breweries now where that happens. I don't know if anyone's been to a brewery where there are a lot of children, but that seems to be the place where they're getting assimilated.
That's true.
For better or for worse. What would Jacobs think of the maintenance of single-family residential zones within Seattle's urban neighborhoods? We've got a few more minutes here, and then I'll just make a quick mention of our next meeting, et cetera, at the end of this. So please go ahead and respond to that question.
Patty? Question's a dud. On to the next one.
Okay. Does Seattle?
I was holding back.
Okay.
A year ago, Seattle passed a law that said you can have a backyard cottage and an in-law apartment on your single-family lot. So Seattle beat Minneapolis actually in eliminating single-family lots. It's a misnomer. We don't have them anymore. And we really need to recognize that we've made a great step towards density. And I think the environmental impact statement estimated 2,500 adjunct units in 10 years. And that's a lot, and there's a lot that we could do to encourage them and make it easier, like low interest loans for people wanting to build within their own unit where they don't need, really, if they didn't have to pay for a permit and they could get the money cheap and could agree to rent for 80% of market, we could get low income units out of it and forgive the loan.
We have just another 2 minutes here. But we have 2 remaining questions, which both could be carried on to future discussions. But let's take a moment to look at the question. I think your version of this was numbered. Anyways, does Seattle qualify as a great American city according to Jacobs' criteria? Why or why not?
I can answer definitively that in the late 1980s, she thought not, because I had correspondence with her about it. I don't know what she would think now.
I think probably still not.
It looks like Maya. Maya, were you going to say something?
No, I was just laughing.
Okay.
Eugenia?
Joe, did you say you corresponded with her about it?
We had, I can't remember which article she wrote that was in either Harper's or Atlantic, that I wrote a letter afterwards relating to some things about Seattle, and she wrote back that she felt that Seattle was too small a place for her theories to apply.
Has she been to Seattle?
I suspect she had not been there in recent years, and that her impression of the city was probably from tremendously earlier.
I hope you saved her letter.
Microsoft was beginning to take off. And this related to the whole this related to her early work or maybe it was even after it was somewhere related to when she was writing Cities and the Wealth of Nations. I can't remember, it was a pre-publication or a post-publication essay. And it was in that context, and actually some things about the way the tech boom here has happened actually fit her theories very well. And that was the nature of my letter. And she seemed to feel that Seattle was not a good example, but I think it may have been more that she was not really up to date on the situation here. Sadly, I don't have a copy of the letter anymore.
Great. Thank you.
Good bookend to the conversation.
Yeah, well, it's 1 o'clock. Thank you all for all of your contributions to this conversation. Our next discussion will be on Wednesday, September 16th, covering part 2, chapters 7 through 12. There's no need to register for that meeting. Your initial registration will will roll over for that. We wanted to take a quick show of hands. For those of you who don't have your video on, you can say aye or something like that. For the timing, we have not established a time frame for the next one, and we wanted to get your input to find out if this time frame worked for you, an earlier time frame would be preferred, or if you prefer a later one. So if you prefer an earlier time frame, like 10 a.m., raise your hand. Okay, to keep it around the same time, midday. Okay, and an evening, like 6 to 7 o'clock time frame. Okay, that's good.
Of course, you just polled the people who showed up at noon.
Good point.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. We may send a survey out to the others that were registered for this that didn't make it, to find out if they would be able to join at another time. But we may just go ahead and stick to this group since you all are here and have committed thus far already.
Bailey, can I pause you? Ricky, can you tell us where you are? That architecture behind you is amazing.
Looks like a church.
It does.
Absolutely. I'm in New Jersey. This is a church in Mount Airy.
Oh, it is a church. It's very cool.
Rural area of New Jersey. Absolutely. This is where I work.
Oh,
great. How did you find us?
I'm a preservationist. I'm in New Jersey. I'm a board member at Preservation New Jersey's marketing committee, and I'm moving to Seattle in 2 years. I have a contract.
Nice.
Cool. You'll
I've been
like
there.
it.
Thank you.
Bailey, before you close, I wanted to thank you and Naomi and Jeff and Eugenia for just, coming up with the idea, for really sort of putting it together, thinking of these great questions. And I want to thank everyone on the call on this for just taking the time to care. I mean, for me, that's what this book is, that sometimes you don't have to micromanage stuff, right? You don't have to plan stuff. You can just let it be, and you can just care. And I think that's what I'm seeing on this Zoom, or just you're inquisitive about what we do. You're inquisitive about how Seattle is forming and being shaped. And I just appreciate the effort and the thought. So Bailey, go ahead. I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, thank you, Kai. All right, thank you, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thanks
Thanks
everyone.
all.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.